Hi, I'm Likho Mbuka. Welcome to season 6 of We Should Be Writing, the podcast. Of course, I'm not alone. I'm with my co-host Zanele.
Hello, I'm Zanele Maduma, and welcome to the podcast. And on this episode, we are celebrating 70 years of the Freedom Charter.
So, one of the principles of our Freedom Charter is the doors of learning shall be open. And to celebrate this 70th anniversary of the Freedom Charter, we are talking about the history of education in South Africa, the challenges we are yet to overcome, and skills for the future.
I agree, Likho. And to help us unpack this very important topic, we have an amazing guest, Irfaan Mangera, who is a political and social activist. Irfaan has worked as a youth advisory panel member at the Gauteng office of the Premier and currently works as PR and media officer at Y20 South Africa 2025, including being the head of education at the We the People, whose mandate is to promote knowledge and understanding of the South African Constitution, its making, and its impact on society.
Let's get to it. Welcome, Ewan, to our podcast, season 6. So let's start with you. I mean, you have been in the trenches of youth activism for 12 years, 13 years. Why the charter is important, drafted by people's vision for a free and equal South Africa.
It's very important. Our democracy is built on the premise of what was written in 1955. And Kliptown is special to me because it's pretty close to where I live in Lenasia. And many of the activists, veterans, and people who I looked up to growing up in my community were part of the formation of what then became the Freedom Charter. But it was the UDF, the movement building of civil society, of sports teams, of women's groups and youth groups who then wanted to voice out on what the future should look like. And for a person like me, I had experienced, the being born into democracy, but when I got to Wits, we in my first year, Fees Must Fall broke out, and it was a reminder to me that the systemic challenges are not solved. And I still remember taking a poster to the union buildings that said, "You promised us that the doors of learning shall be open." And we are here to claim back on that because that promise has not been delivered. And so it's important because much of what was the hope and aspirations of ordinary South Africans is still yet to be realized. And we have to keep reminding ourselves that 70 years, yes, in comparison to the years of colonialism and imperialism and apartheid, it's small, but by now we should have still seen some significant changes, and it requires us to do more.
Okay, thank you for that. You've mentioned movements like Fees Must Fall, and I'm sure you were there. You were advocating for free education, so that reopened this debate. Looking back, what lessons did that moment leave us with?
Many, lessons. In fact, it was the shift for me to move away from just doing the same old, going into a job and working in a school versus actually trying to change the system. And so since then, I've taken the conscious decision to be the type of troublemaker that is good trouble. But Fees Must Fall taught us that you have to unite if you want a common outcome and a common vision. The same way that they did when they formed the Freedom Charter, when they put those ideas together,
Yeah.
when they were forming the constitution of this
Yeah.
country. It took political tolerance and difficult, hard principle choice to work with people who ordinarily you don't ideologically agree with. I remember just downstairs, we were with leaders who are from the EFF, from the ANC, from the
Yeah.
PYA Alliance as a whole, from independent people who felt like they don't belong to a party. And that showcased to us that if we had one vision, we could unite people towards, and particularly young people, towards radically changing society.
I mean, look, if we read the Freedom Charter, it was clear that the education should be a right, not a privilege. Mentioning the fees must fall movements and mentioning that students took it to streets, they were fighting for education. It didn't end there. You even mentioned that you were even part of the group of people who went to union buildings, picketing. Do you think South Africa has honored that promise of free education and that education should be a right and not a privilege?
I think in many ways we have. I state this because we have to understand the complexity of what the Bantu education had meant for South Africans, right? You had 15 different education systems, and now you get into democracy, and now you have to make it into one equal promise of a free, fair, equal education. Has it delivered fully on that promise? No. Schools are still overcrowded. University access is still limited because the amount of graduates who finish matric and are able to get to university can't get to university. TVET colleges are also are constrained in the number of people they can train and capacitate. But the bigger worry for me is the pipeline. There's many different broken cracks along the journey, and I speak about this when I say ECD is the most important part of our education system, and yet we find young people there not unqualified people doing the training and teaching. Yes, there's been some policy shifts now, but it needs resourcing, because if you don't develop at that age 2 to 3, 4 properly, your whole life is already set. There's particular parts of your brain that doesn't get developed, and that's the challenge in this process.
I'm glad that we are talking about this, because it brings me to this question. Do you, with the number of dropouts that we are currently experiencing, which is estimated around 60%,
Yeah.
how does that tie into the failure that we are talking about of this Freedom Charter principle not having fully, encompassed or achieved what it was set out to do or to achieve 70 years ago? So just looking at the stats, talking about the dropouts in schools and also in universities.
I think by and large, South Africans still believe that what was captured in the Freedom Charter still is what they espouse and have a vision for. The problem today is we have to separate what that promise was and that document being an aspirational document versus what we currently have is huge government corruption, a system that is mismatched in many ways, lack of proper spending when it comes to certain things. And so I am worried about the dropout rate, because 4 out of 10 learners dropping out before they finish matric is a problem. And I say this because all research and stats show you that the chances of actually getting a job is far more higher if you have dropped out without a matric. At least with a matric, there's some chance of you getting something. But the problem here is you're leaving without a skill, without an education.
Yeah.
And so you now have a crisis, and our crisis of need of youth not in any form of employment, education, entrepreneurship opportunities, or training is over 4 million young people, which means we have to ask the question, where are these young people? They're not in anything. They're not in jobs. They're not working. So they're just simply existing in survival mode wherever they are. How do we not take responsibility as leaders, as activists, as people who have some privilege in society to say,
and policymakers,
to go fetch, where are these young people? How do we get them in the system? A country can't exist with this levels of breakdown, of social economic breakdown. And so the dropout rate needs to be fixed. There has been some interventions. I know the shift from, for example, ECD, moving it from social development to Department of Education is helpful. But the premise of people dropping out is you have child-headed households. I now need to go and fend and get some change so that I can put some food on the table. And again, some, I'm saying some deliberately because often it's not even enough. For a couple of days, you're going hungry. There are at least 20 million South Africans who are food insecure. And so you understand why dropout is the way it is. There's a youngster, I mean, I ran a small campaign during June for my birthday around food. And the youngster I found just next to my community in Waterworks said he's begging at 9 p.m. midwinter, saying, I don't go to school. My mother is alone at home with my sisters. She said, no, we have to go and put food on the table. Now you ask yourself this question is how do we solve a systemic problem? And this is, you are a lot more likely to find someone in this condition now than you actually won't find them.
So basically what you're saying is that if the problem of these dropouts, for example, just the number itself being this high, and also just getting the people who have moved out of the system back into the system, there are many other issues, probably not even related to education itself, that needs to be looked at in order to be able to resolve this issue.
100%. Many students go to school because you get one meal a day.
Yeah.
And that's probably the only meal they're going to get that day. And parents encourage them to do that because, they can't be the providers that they should be. And it's not a individual problem. It's not the responsibility of those parents alone, because you now exist in a system that doesn't have jobs. There's no growth of the economy. In fact, less people are getting employed while more people are being birthed into the country. So now you have this crisis on your hands. Other reasons involve mental health. Other reasons involve young people who simply feel like education is not of value. And again, it's the economic question. I've been speaking to many principals and teachers because I've graduated as a teacher. And the inputs to me is that part of the reason they don't take it as seriously is they don't think they're seeing their siblings sit at home with degrees. Now, what do you do in a situation?
So therefore, they don't see the value of
value of
education because
yeah.
there's no one around them who is actually modeling what education can be able to do for you if you pursue it.
Exactly. And if you're in a context like a township where that's the constant reality, yes, you may have a couple of people who do inspire. There are so many young people I found who run their NGOs, who are not giving up hope, who are actually getting young people to come and get skills and get trained. But again, those initiatives need to be systematic. The system has to provide for it and not just individuals alone.
Would you say that Fees Must Fall was successful in achieving its main goal?
I think in many ways yes, but there's also a no that I've brought critique to for a couple of years.
Would you mind expanding on that? Where does the yes come in and where does the no come in? Sure. Just briefly.
I think for yes, many students today bear the fruits of NSFAS being not just not a loan, but a bursary scheme that actually gives them access to university. Is it enough? No, but that's another problem around the fiscus, around the economy needing to grow, so there's more budget. The second thing is, I think insourcing was a big fight for Fees Must Fall as well. We mustn't forget that it wasn't just students, just workers as well. And many universities have taken the progressive stance of making sure workers are insourced, so there's no exploitation of workers. There are many other things that I think have been inspirational about Fees Must Fall, and this year is 10 years of it, so it's important to reflect. But on the no side, I think we forget that people at universities only account for like 6% of young people in the country. And so when you speak about 6%, my no comes in where we're saying, did we just fight for us and those of some degree of privilege who have access? Or should we be fighting also the same way the youth in the 70s did it, where they went back from universities like Wits with documents, with readings to go and hold classes
Yeah.
informal teaching classes with learners and students there back home in their communities to help conscientize them about what we should be fighting for as a system, so that those young people who often are hopeless, who don't have access to opportunities and the same privileges, can also benefit from a change system that gives them hope, that gives them prosperity and equality that we hope for. So that's where my no comes in.
What does the future look like? That's my first, and my last question is is looking at what sort of training that needs to happen for the youth and those who are still able.
You're right. I don't think
to
it's
move
just.
us forward.
I don't think it's just the youth. Policy problems in this country is that now you've suddenly have only under 35s can get hired.
It's a huge
And
problem.
that's a
Irfaan.
problem.
A
Yeah.
huge problem.
Fundamentally, as a society, as a government, you can't make that kind of policy choice, because if you are 38, you have a family now, you need to work, and you can't get a job because of that policy problem. We really have to rethink how and who makes policy. And I think Iran people need to register to vote and vote for people who can get a job done. But that's by the way. Vocational training is important, and it should be accessible across the board for anyone who needs it. It also should be popularized. We should stop this shameful thinking that only a university degree and becoming a doctor, a lawyer, or something is actually of value in society. We have seen how big of an impact a plumber can make to your life, an electrician can make to your life. And so
Yeah.
all those things are critical, and we are seeing government try their best to do that. But I think the problems are structural, and unless you are building many of these TVETs every year, you're going to have a problem. I'll end on the question about hope and the future. The future is not as
bleak.
no, the future is a bit bleak. It's a bit harrowing, and it's gonna get a bit worse before it gets better, because you're seeing global shifts, and we can't think of ourselves as an island on its own. Nepalese youth took corrupt
they took it to
politicians
streets.
to the
Yeah.
streets. They burned their parliament. It has been happening in Kenya, Indonesia. I can name many countries. For us in South Africa, if we don't start grappling with the systemic problems, we are not going to fix what we have built. And
That's
I think
true.
on the side of hope, we must never lose hope. Even in a time of despair, if Mandela and if Kathrada and if all the people who were imprisoned, in exile, even underground, gave up hope, we would not be sitting here today. And so hope is what ignites revolutions, and it ignites change, and ignites us to take some form of action. And so I'd leave it on that, because we must never give in to despair.
Now we are joined by Ewan.
Dawkins. Ewan Dawkins.
Ewan Dawkins, yes, who is a law, politics, and international relations student here at Wits University. He is also the director of policy and politics and youth policy advisor at So We Vote. So we are going to be learning from him who is So We Vote and what it is that they are doing there. Just briefly. He is also, he provides commentary on political, legal, and social issues affecting South Africa, and has been featured actually on numerous media broadcast houses such as the SABC, ENCA, Al Jazeera, The Citizen, and others.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for your time. We truly appreciate it, Likho.
Thank you so much, Ewan. With conversation that we've had with Irfaan, we touched on the question of do you think, or is South Africa has honored that promise? Could you please take us through?
Well, I was very happy when I got this call, because I wanted to give a student's perspective. As someone currently studying at Wits, currently a student who only graduated high school 2 years ago, I think we can give a definitive no, although a no with a few caveats. I think the Freedom Charter was very explicit when it said the doors of education must be opened and the doors of culture and learning must be open. And what I think we've seen, and I think what the ANC has done in the last 30 years, has been to fundamentally move the old apartheid system to combine 9 different educational systems into one non-racial, caps-based educational system, But what they've done since then is created a two-tier system where you have really well-performing former Model C schools in the public education system, and then your vast majority of schools who are much underperforming the average. So if we're talking about the ideology of how schools have been transformed, we can see there has been a move from race-based
Yeah.
education,
Yeah.
maybe a move towards the decolonization of some aspects of education.
Mhm.
I know in matric, in my latter years of high school, a lot of the old names of like Anglo-Boer War became the South African War. So there's a slow progression where Steve Biko is being introduced, different non-racial and South African teaching structures are being introduced.
Yeah, I mean, like even our constitution, like Section 9 of Section 29 guarantees us education as a right. But I'm really interested in your view. How does that align with all the fall short of the Freedom Charter's vision?
Well, I think the problem we have is that we conflate the Freedom Charter and the Constitution too much.
Yeah.
I think
yeah.
we make the mistake to think that the ANC adopted the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter and the Constitution are different. And it's different because the Freedom Charter is explicitly a socialist document. It's a document that was written by the people for the people.
Yes.
And what happened in
yes.
1994 was not a move towards complete democracy. It was a compromise. So to say that we are falling short of the Freedom Charter should be evidently true, because our fundamental aim wasn't to achieve the Freedom Charter. But if we look at Section 9 of the Constitution, we're often asked, what is the point of a right that we can't exercise? And there are some legal utilities of it. But I suppose if young people really want to see those sort of rights being exercised, what I think we need to move towards is having younger leadership in office.
So let's look at, for example, the current Minister of Basic Education in South Africa, which is Mrs. Siviwe, right? And do you think, would you say that that's a step forward, or you would relate it to what you just said, that it's a young face, but
I think
old systems?
Most of my critique of young leaders come from the ANC. But if we are going to look at a young leader from the DA, they don't have the same systemic cultural issue that the ANC has, that it brings its young leaders into. But it's got its own sort of decaying system. She has been caught up in many scandals of trying to commodify education, doing partnerships with McDonald's, trying to move education into a more commodified approach.
Is that a bad thing, though?
Well, I don't think we've seen a lot of progress from it. I think if we're going to be honest about what we want and what we think is best for our children, I don't think what's best for our children is turning them into a product, in looking at the future generation as something to be sold, something to be commodified. And I think her flaw or her issue is that she is young and she has been making some progress, but she still refuses to talk to organizations like Equal Education, organizations that don't have the same right-wing framing as the DA's policy. So her flaw is more of a pragmatic DA right-wing dogmatism instead of, an ANC's cultural issue with young leaders.
We were talking about the issue of the number of dropouts that are being counted at the moment, whether in schools or at university level. And we also kind of, had a chat about, some of the reasons why this is happening. What do you think, like in your perspective, what do you think is going on? What would you say is the core issue of us being in 2025 and still be experiencing or having these issues where we have children who are dropping out of schools at the very young age and not being able to reach grade 12, their matric year? And we also have first years at universities, like a huge number, of students dropping out at universities. What do you think, in your view, is the core issue and how that can be resolved?
Well, I think
Especially, Ewan, I'm so sorry to
No
cut you
problem.
off, especially looking at if we had to bring in the fees must fall movement into it.
that.
Exactly. How is it that we are still experiencing this, even
Even
such a
post
huge...
fees must falls.
Exactly.
Well, I think the issue with schools specifically is that we can do so much to legislate and transform schools at the level of paperwork. But if children still come from poor communities, parents that don't have jobs, single family homes, the pressures that are on these children are so much more than the pressures that just exist at school. And we can try and regulate schools, make it safer, make them places that children are comfortable to be in. But if they're going home and they're going to a family that maybe the children have to take care of their parents, maybe parents are suffering from HIV and AIDS, there's much larger systemic social issues that are really impacting on these children. I remember back in high school, I had many friends that couldn't come to school because they couldn't afford transport. They couldn't, the schools were too far away for them to be able to get there every day. But I think the dropout rate is not completely indicative of a failure of our pass rates with the 30% or 40% pass rate, but more of a failure of the culture around the societies that children are coming from. I think there's a lot of kids that think, okay, it's much better for me to go and hustle than to go to school because I see so many of my brothers, cousins graduating and then being unemployed. So there's a national crisis in terms of the communities children are coming from that I think is leading mainly to this large dropout. In terms of universities, first-year students, it's a massive change. I remember my first year coming to Wits was a complete new world for me. And I know a lot of people coming from KZN, coming from many rural places, coming to the big city is a very big change. And when Wits has policies like mid-year exclusions, sort of things that don't allow first years to aggregate and be comfortable with that system, there's obviously going to be a lot of dropout.
In closing would be, what do you think should happen with vocational work where because I mean it seems as though emphasis and efforts are put into after matric you go to university, yes, and then I think there's so much potential and a lot of things that can be done with other routes, taking other routes as opposed to
100%.
this particular one, and also just the destigmatization of
TVET colleges or vocational
Yeah.
training.
So
Yeah.
just on those two things as we close.
Well, I think there's a double issue with vocational training. So firstly, there's great stigmatization around of it. People think it's a second option. For a lot of people, it isn't, and it shouldn't be a second option. But secondly is the question of if TVET colleges have and can solve South Africa's issue. South Africa's economy is based around mainly large businesses and large businesses that are centered in specific industries and in specific areas. Countries like Germany that have vocational training built into their high schools have large service-based economies where these children or students can feed in. So trying to copy those systems from countries that have a completely different economic base is not going to exactly solve our issues. But there definitely needs to be some sort of integration of TVET programs into the high school level, as we've seen in other countries. That looks like integration of vocational training, I think, from grade 9 upwards, where you usually pick your subjects to prepare you for university. You can have a separate slate of subjects to prepare you for vocational training. But onto the point of what must be done, that's the question on everyone's minds. And I think, like you mentioned earlier, the point of So We Vote, the point of these organizations, youth anger and youth uprisings are going to always happen. We just saw in Nepal. They're going to happen spontaneously without anyone, being able to see it. And what we need to have is organizations that are ready and that are prepared to, capitalize on these movements when they do occur to create real change. So it looks like this so-called protest that's happening on the 24th of September, unled, unorganized. If organizations are ready as a vanguard, able to take this strength and this anger from these spontaneous students' movements, they'll be able to spearhead that direction of student power into real change.
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
Let me ask you this very, very last question, which is the same question that we posed to Irfaan. What does the future look like for South Africa when we look at the doors of education and learning and culture being open? What does the future look like?
I don't want to give a negative and unoptimistic view.
Yeah.
And I don't think we have to. I think there is some hope. I think the 2024 election was evidence of people saying they've had enough.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time for things to change, especially in education. But I think this generation is one that is going to be left behind and may only be the force that moves South Africa into a better place.
You've been listening to The Doors of Learning and Culture Shall Be Open, an episode of the We Should Be Writing podcast. This is a product of the Honours in Journalism and Media Studies program at the Wits Centre for Journalism in Johannesburg. Our producers, editors, and show hosts were Zanele Maduma and Likho Mbuka. Our theme music was composed by Stoic and graphic design was by Hector Sibran and Anganati Jack. Additional episode music credits and info are available on our Spotify page. On all social media, we are at Wits Vuvuzela, and you can see more of our work on witsvuvuzela.com.